Hi, Josiah here. I recently uploaded a video recording of me reading a speech that I wrote for a local activist rally. One man, by the name of Eye of Braille, responded to that speech, identifying himself as an anti-feminist and expressing firm disagreement with my message. This video is a reply to his comments, as well as a general response to various anti-feminist arguments I've seen posted around YouTube and other social media sites. I welcome ongoing dialogue about these topics, so feel free to argue if you think my ideas are in error. Here is part 1 of my response. To start with, I'd like to say thank you. In all sincerity, no sarcasm intended, I was very impressed and pleased with your civility, intelligence, and rationality in these comments. It takes only a few seconds of looking at the typical responses to any sort of pro-feminist video on YouTube to see what kind of tone and level of discourse I could reasonably expect from opponents to these views. You disagreed with me very clearly, but did so without personally attacking me or resorting to hateful and unproductive terms like feminazi and the like. I appreciate this very much, and it makes me want to engage in real dialogue about this with you, rather than just a series of hostile snipes or blow-offs. First of all, I'm very aware that this video/speech is quite flawed, especially for this milieu. I wrote this not with the intention of broadcasting it on YouTube to the internet at large, but just to speak live at a specific event to a specific group of people. The type of men that I intended to target with this speech were those whom I imagined might reasonably be present at that event. Men who are already somewhat to very sympathetic toward feminism or women's issues, but perhaps not especially committed as of yet to really taking up the struggle. Men who needed a reminder, or a kick in the pants, or a wake-up call, but who were already at least partially aligned with feminist ideas. I think that for such men specifically, the tone and type of arguments I used are quite a bit more appropriate than they end up being when applied to all men in general. Secondarily, I just didn't do a great job. I was very tired and sleep deprived when I wrote this, which I was doing at basically the last minute. I was hypomanic and had been awake for a long time, and I was feeling all worked up and angry about rape, so my emotions bled into the writing more than would have been ideal. Also, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not any kind of professional writer or speaker. In fact, this is really the first time as an adult that I've written and delivered a speech anywhere. I have a 9th grade education. I also tend to write way too much, and I didn't have time to do any editing, so a lot of rambly or problematic bits that might have been cut out of this ended up not being cut. So your compliment about my oratory is exceedingly generous, and I thank you for it, even though I don't think it's deserved. If I was writing something aimed specifically at anti-feminists, it would be very different from this. If I was speaking directly with a specific man about this topic, it would also be very different. I can completely understand why a lot of this would rub you the wrong way. You're not the intended audience. Given that fact, I think you responded with remarkable restraint and respectfulness. So once again, thank you. I should clarify that I do not hate men, or hate anyone, and I don't advocate for any form of hate. I don't think that men are inherently evil, or that men per se are the enemy. I think that we live in a twisted culture which teaches men, myself included, some really awful things, and that we should rightly be angry at that culture, at those traditional ideas which have been mindlessly passed down for countless generations, at those lies that have wounded all of us, made us weaker, pettier, and just plain less than we could be, than we should be as men. I don't think there's any toxicity in me toward anyone, no actual feeling of condemnation or judgment of actual people, just a defiance against the fucked up narrative that we as men have been force-fed since we were all little boys. If I gave another impression, please see preceding paragraphs about how I did a poor job with the speech. I definitely do not mean to suggest, nor do I believe, that all men are rapists, or want to be rapists, or think that rape is good. Of course we're not. The majority of us wouldn't dream of raping anyone, I know that. But rape still happens far too often, and many of us, some men might actually be ignorant of it, know that, and do little or nothing about it. What I argue is simply that rape is such a horrific, unacceptable thing, something so unsuitable for our modern, civilized society, that it's time that we take action and stop it. Men have been turning a blind eye to rape for, well, as long as we've been humans. It is more nominally disapproved of now than perhaps ever before, but that is, for the most part, merely lip service. Most men don't really care enough about it to make any sort of effort to end this savage scourge upon our society. When I suggest that we are all guilty, all complicit, I mean that insofar as we are not preventing it, we are enabling it. That it couldn't keep happening, especially not with such great frequency, without a whole lot of men looking the other way, staying silent, automatically defending accused rapists, and more or less not giving a shit. The biggest thing I see men arguing about in contradiction to feminist statements is the idea that men, or that women, rather, are primarily the victims of violence and rape, whereas men are not. The statistics, whichever ones are mentioned, about how often women are assaulted are always challenged, and the fact that men are also victims of violence from women is always brought up. Regarding statistics, I can only say, fuck the statistics. I have no idea which statistics are correct, if any. Most likely, all statistics reported anywhere are done so with some kind of bias by some group with some kind of agenda, so frankly, they're all suspect. I don't need any statistics to know what I've seen and experienced in my life. So no matter what the percentages actually look like, I've known many, many women who have been seriously physically abused by men, and many, many women who have been sexually assaulted by men. I've known extremely few men who have been seriously physically assaulted by women. As an aside, regarding man-on-man rape, yes, obviously it's real, and it happens in prison a lot, and it's a horrible thing. I did 4.5 years in prison, so no one needs to tell me that men are raped too. But it's entirely tangential, literally a totally different subject to man-on-woman rape out in the non-prison world. Bringing it up is nothing but a distraction, a diversionary tactic, because it has zero bearing on the issue of whether or not women are getting raped a lot, and why, and what should be done about it. I'm very much in favor of fighting for prison reform and for changing our cultural disregard for the incarcerated. But that is, as I've said, a completely separate topic. The argument is often raised that women actually commit as much domestic violence as men do, or perhaps even more. I have no idea if this is factually true or not, but for the sake of argument, I'm willing to accept that it is. The problem is, this is so very much a false equivalency. As much as I'm likely to anger some people by saying this, I think we just need to face a very basic fact here. Women are much less dangerous than men are. Yeah, I said it. The truth of the matter is, men pose a significantly greater physical threat than women do. Men are much stronger and more aggressive biologically, and men are much more enculturated or trained from childhood to be aggressive, violent, and physically dominant. Obviously, these are generalizations, and of course exceptions exist. I'm not saying that all men are necessarily violent, or that women cannot train to be strong and learn to fight well and be badasses. But on average, any given man is going to be more physically dangerous than an average woman. Think about the women you know. If you hit them as hard as you could, and they hit you as hard as they could, which one of you is really more likely to be hurt? If you decided to go berserk and do your very best to severely injure a woman, to batter her into unconsciousness, even to kill her with your bare hands, how likely do you think it is that you could manage to do it? If she decided to try to do the same thing to you, assuming you defended yourself to the best of your ability, how likely do you think it is that she could manage to do it? So, even if women do initiate violence against men as often, or nearly as often, or even slightly more often than men do, which I think seems a bit suspect as a premise, given what I've seen in my life, but I'll concede that it's possible. Even if they do, it's not equivalent, because the results of that violence are very different. Now, maybe you've known a very different kind of men, and a different kind of women than I have. Maybe you've simply had men reveal things to you that they've hidden from me, and women hide things from you that they've revealed to me. That's entirely possible. But in my actual experience, countless women that I've known have been beaten up, sexually assaulted, physically threatened or dominated, and raped by men. I've seen the aftermath. I've heard their stories. I've witnessed the situations they're in. On top of that, I've read many, many more stories from women online detailing the brutality they've suffered at the hands of men. I've seen the black eyes, the busted lips, the bruises, the even worse injuries inflicted upon women by men many times. And I've seen pictures and videos of significantly more such evidence. I've heard extremely few stories and seen virtually no physical evidence of men being similarly hurt by women in my life. When women abuse men, they rarely inflict much injury, or else the men of the world are absolute geniuses at hiding it. When men abuse women, they almost always inflict injury, sometimes extreme injury, and many women try to hide it too. The psychological effects of this violence cannot be ignored either. As the stronger, more physically dangerous sex, we have the privilege of being able to not notice or think about the power differential between us and women. We don't need to be aware of the fact that we're much more capable of hurting women than they are of hurting us, because that dynamic favors us and our safety. But women are keenly aware of that difference, and they have to be. Sometimes as men we find it unfair, unreasonable, maybe even hurtful that women seem so automatically suspicious of us, so guarded, treating us as though we're all just monsters waiting to attack them. But those precautions make sense for them, given how much of a threat we could potentially be. Lacking weapons or special training, many women know very clearly, in a great many situations, that if the man or men she is with suddenly decided to hurt or rape or even kill her, she would probably have very little chance of preventing that. Now stop for a minute and think about that. Can you imagine that? Have you ever been in a power dynamic like that? Can you see that reality through the eyes of the more vulnerable person, through the eyes of a woman? Imagine being on a date, alone with someone, and knowing in the back of your head, if this person decides to assault me, I'm not going to be able to fight them off. Imagine feeling that sense of threat from all of the men you deal with on a day-to-day basis. Now add to that the fact that almost certainly men have already used force against you in one or more terrifying ways in your life, and that nearly every other girl and woman you know has also told you the stories of men using force against them to hurt them or control them or take sexual liberties that are not consented to. Can you imagine how scary it would be to walk down a street alone and be watched or harassed by strange men? How scary it would be to be alone with some man you don't know well, who could be any kind of psychopath or even just a regular selfish dude who loses his self-control when he gets frustrated. How scary would it be to be around a man when he gets angry, when he starts yelling and you don't know what he might do? It's not that all men necessarily are hostile, dangerous, potential aggressors, or rapists. It's just that if one of them decides to be, the level of threat that represents to a woman is enormous. and they are aware of that fact all the time. Conversely, we as men have the privilege to blithely go through life with nary a care for our physical safety in most circumstances. How often have you ever actually been afraid of a woman? How often have you perceived a woman as an imminent physical threat? How often have you been approached by a strange woman when you were alone and felt, for even the tiniest moment, a flicker of fear or worry about whether or not she might hurt you? How often have you been flirting with a woman and reached that moment where she suggests that the two of you find some place to be alone, and you had a sudden spike of anxiety about what danger you might be going into? We can walk down the streets at night alone with little to no fear. We can be anywhere alone without having to consider the possibility that some man might encounter us, and if he had hostile intentions, we'd have no way to stop him and no one to turn to for help. Admittedly, some men have greater or lesser fear of other men, especially in certain environments, but that's still a testament to the threatening nature of men. It's not a fear of violence from women. Seriously, have you ever actually felt a moment of terror about the possibility of a woman hurting you physically? I mean, guns can obviously change the dynamic, as they're a great equalizer, but we aren't talking about gun violence here. We're talking about everyday domestic abuse and sexual assault. I'd argue that when someone has a gun, you aren't afraid of that person, you're afraid of the gun. So please know, a woman pointed a gun at me and it was terrifying, so your whole position is invalid. Not that I think you'd make that argument. When men are hit or otherwise physically attacked by women, it often has little injurious effect. But even more so, it nearly always has little to no psychological impact. It's something to laugh about. The guys I've known who have been hit by a woman, or had something thrown at their head, or been stabbed with an eyeliner pencil, or whatever, they make a big joke about it. It's a funny story, something to tell to amuse your buddies. It has produced no lasting fear or insecurity in the man. It hasn't changed how he sees himself, or how he sees women, or his basic sense of safety in relationships. It's just a cute little thing that happened. Haha, yeah, she was sure mad. It actually hurt when she hit me. I was surprised she could hit that hard. Haha, haha, haha. Insert demeaning narrative which reasserts man in position of dominance and puts recalcitrant female back in her place here. If anything ever happens which is remotely like a sexual assault by a woman against a man, the stories about that incident are even more lighthearted and self-congratulatory. For a man, in general, of course I know there are exceptions, a woman trying to forcefully coerce him into sex is one part hilarious to one part ego-boosting, but almost never terrifying or emotionally damaging. Even if women are physically aggressing against men as often or more often than men are against them, nowadays the results are very, very different. The level of physical injury is hugely different, and perhaps even more so, the level of psychological trauma is totally incomparable. Women do not laugh when they tell their survivor stories. It's not a funny anecdote, because they're the ones on the weaker side of the power dynamic here. So for them, it's a much more traumatic thing. They're the ones who feel, generally and relatively, helpless in these situations. They're the ones whose sense of bodily autonomy, psychological security, and agency are violated. A woman hitting a man is, for the most part, no big deal to the man. It doesn't make him feel helpless. It doesn't instill fear into him about future interactions with this woman or all women. It doesn't diminish his sense of self at all. A man hitting a woman is, for the most part, always a big deal to the woman. To suggest that male-on-female violence or sexual aggression is even remotely equivalent to female-on-male violence or sexual aggression is colossally unfair, willfully ignorant, and a blatant denial of the fact of the great physical, psychological, and social differences in power, both factual and perceived, between men and women in these situations. It's so easy for us to just ignore these things, to never think about them, because hey, we're the ones with the power. It's easy to get defensive when violence of men against women is called out, because we don't want to feel bad and say, hey, women are violent to men too, just as often even, so don't make this about us. But it is about us, because of what we're actually capable of doing to women, because of the actual effect our physical or sexual violence has on women. Truly, it doesn't go both ways. They can't hurt us to anywhere remotely near the degree that we can hurt them. Can't and don't and never have. The fact that women are even responding with violence toward men at all in this very recent modern era is a new and surprising thing. Men have had women firmly under their forceful, violently dominant thumb for millennia. If they finally started fighting back a little bit, I cannot see that as anything else but the old, I learned it from watching you scenario from this classic old PSA from my childhood. Link inserted in the description or in an annotation. It's not individual men who are the problem. Individual men, even some of the very worst of them, are still human beings with a richly complex landscape of inner qualities, motivations, and potential. One of the things I am most grateful to my troubled life for is the fact that it has provided me with the opportunity to meet and get to know intimately a very wide range of types of men, including those who are outside of the fringes of society and acceptability. My years living on the street, my years in mental hospitals, and my years in prison put me face to face and shoulder to shoulder with men of extreme personalities, extreme mental dysfunction, and extreme violence. I have met some of the worst, believe me, and the incredible lesson I learned is this: they're all okay. They're all just human beings, just men, just like me. They have varying levels of damage, of twistedness, of brokenness, of toxic conditioning, of disability, of pain. And these things inform their beliefs and their behavior. But they all still have good in them, and the possibility of more good. I do not believe that anyone is irredeemable, or that anyone is utterly lacking in value to humanity as they are right now. So trust me when I say that I am not intending to vilify actual men, to call them monsters and condemn them. It is the culture that we men are brought up in, that we are surrounded and continuously poisoned by, that I see as monstrous. It's that set of ugly, toxic, endlessly harmful beliefs and the kinds of personalities and behaviors that those beliefs create in men that I condemn. It's not about naming and shaming the bad men. It's about pinpointing, exposing, and excoriating the bad beliefs about men, about women, about manhood, about femininity and masculinity, about gender roles, about violence, about dominance, about aggression, about sex, about relationships, about our bodies, about personal freedoms, and about respecting the freedoms of others. When feminists decry patriarchy, some people seem to think they're talking about some evil cabal of male overlords who are running the world and doing their damnedest to oppress women however they can. But that's not what patriarchy actually is. It's a body of ideas about how the world is or should be, and how people are or should be. Those ideas are not merely the enemy of women. They're the enemy of every person in the world. They hurt us all. They keep us hurting each other. But it doesn't have to be that way.